Hey, what's up everyone? Airball here from the Lorcana Academy. I am your tenured tryhard on staff, and today we've got a little bit of a different video for you. So, Lorcana organized play and like in-store play is finally starting to pop up. And it's not unrealistic anymore to be able to build a 60-card deck, take it to your local game store, and play in a competitive setting against other people. And so I think it's a good idea to take stock now of what the meta is and what kind of deck you might want to build. And there's like two questions that I want to answer with this video. First is, what kind of deck is right for you? And just stylistically, what kind of Lorcana game do you want to be playing? And given that, which is the best type of that deck for you to play right now, given what your opponents are playing? And so let's take a step back. For those of you who are not like super familiar with card games, there are three main archetypes of decks that you play in Lorcana. There are aggro decks that try to just quest with their creatures as early and often as possible, end the game quickly. There are control decks, which essentially do the opposite. They try to make the game go long and win the game with big spells, so like big effects, and try to just stop the opponent from ending the game before you can get to your late game, which is going to be better than theirs. And then, if you don't like either of those, you have mid-range decks, and that's kind of in the middle of the two, like the name implies. And you can either play aggressively sometimes, or play controlling sometimes, depending on what you're up against. And so this is the kind of deck that will reward strategy and early identification of what you're up against, and reward you for knowing what your opponents are playing very quickly based on their first few cards, and then what your role in that matchup is. So those are very popular decks right now on Pixelborn and in paper. And so take a second, think about what kind of player you are stylistically. Do you want to be questing? Do you want to be stopping your opponents? Or do you want to do a little of both? And then once you've made that decision, we can hop into our discussion of what decks fit within each archetype and the overall rankings of the decks. Okay, before we get into the actual tier list ranking of these decks, I think it's important to point out two things. First is that there's going to be a healthy dose of opinion in this. A lot of people have a lot of strong opinions about where these decks should fit on a tier list, and that's fine. It's good that people are passionate about it. But the problem is that there's not a whole lot of data to go off of. There haven't been a lot of really big Lorcana tournaments yet. A lot of them are played in paper right now, like played on physical tabletop with real cards. And so a lot of the reason that a deck might be successful or might not be is just because people can't find the cards to build the natural predators of those decks. So we are going to be like considering how these decks are doing in those settings, but you also have to remember that they may not continue to do that because maybe people just can't find like that control killer card or that mid-range killer card. So there's going to be some of my own personal subjective opinion mixed into this tier list, and that might mean it lands in a different order than it does for you. That doesn't mean you're right. It doesn't mean I'm right. But I think it's good to have a healthy discussion starting off point and not be at each other's throats. So with that in mind, let's get into the actual tier list rankings as I have them. So first is Ruby Amethyst Control. And this is a deck that has been dominating paper gameplay. The most recent Lorcana HQ tournament, I think, 5 of the top 8 decks in the tournament were Ruby Amethyst Control. And this is like a consistent theme across all of the major paper Lorcana events that we've been seeing so far. This deck is built around, you know, the board wipe, be prepared, card draw from Amethyst with cards like Friends on the other side, and also the late game bomb that is 𝚱𝙴𝙼𝙺, who can lock down opponent's creatures and also quest for 3 to slam the door shut. This deck is very good at controlling, obviously, the game. That's kind of the name of the deck. But also, it's very good at taking advantage of players who overcommit into Be Prepared. So if you are trying to play the game very aggressively and just spill your cards onto the table as quickly as you can to try to win, and you don't think about what and you don't try to plan around getting your board wiped, then this deck takes advantage of you very aggressively. Be Prepared is just an absolute beating if you put everything on the board and don't have any follow-up for the turn after it's played. It's also got these general purpose answers, which is a very powerful effect in Lorcana right now. So a board wipe, almost everything that every deck is trying to do is based on characters right now. And no matter what they're trying to do with those characters, they can't do it if those characters aren't on the battlefield. And Be Prepared and Dragon's Fire and Maleficent and those kinds of cards are very good at keeping characters off the battlefield. And it's hard to make progress in the game as long as you can achieve that. Also, the level of play in events right now is just kind of low. There hasn't been a whole lot of people being able to practice, not a whole lot of actual games being played, and people aren't prepared to deal with be prepared. So I think that this deck is very, very good right now, but it might not necessarily continue to be this dominant overall force once A, card availability goes up, and B, player skill goes up. If Ruby Amethyst doesn't end up being this overall dominating S tier deck and need bans or whatever in the format, the next best deck to try to challenge that is probably this Amber Steel Songs list, and this is like more of a mid-range kind of deck. It can play pretty aggressively. It has a bunch of 1-drops and 2-drop characters designed to like empty your hand quickly and efficiently, so that a whole new world draws you 6 or 7 cards, and it draws your opponent 2 or 3. So it gains card advantage in that way, which is a very mid-range thing to do. But the way in which it does that is by putting a bunch of stuff onto the battlefield, which is more of an aggro thing to do. And you also have access to Tinkerbell Giant Fairy, which is kind of a controlling plan. So all 3 of those things taken together, all 3 of those elements, make it a very powerful mid-range deck. And as long as the pilot isn't playing aggressively into something like Be Prepared and is like able to know what their opponent is up to, this deck is very, very hard to deal with. So if you're a very skilled mid-range player, then I think this is probably the deck for you. All right, so now we get into the A tier. This is the tier of decks that like can win a tournament. They're not necessarily the most likely ones to do it, but you can feel good if you are a specialist in this kind of deck and you trust in your own ability to play them, you can still win a tournament that you take this kind of thing to. And the best aggro deck in the format right now in the A tier is this Amber Emerald list. And its plan is very simple. It's trying to stick Lilo into play, stick Flynn Rider into play, and put Simba in play to protect them so that they get to quest several times before your opponent can actually remove them from the board. So if you have Lilo in play on turn 1, Simba in play on turn 2, and then you start questing with Flynn, you can be questing for 5 or even 6 lore as early as turn 3 or 4, and if your opponent can't deal with your entire board or even deal with just Lilo or Flynn until turns 4 or 5, then you've quested for a bunch and you're very close to just winning the game. So it puts a lot of pressure on your opponent early and is probably the most resilient aggro plan in the format right now. The next deck in the A tier is this Amber Amethyst control list. It is very similar in spirit to the Ruby Amethyst list in that it is trying to get to the late game and it is trying to win the game with big effects, which is what sort of defines control as an archetype. But it's not controlling the board with cards like Dragon's Fire, Be Prepared, and Maleficent, but instead it's controlling the board with the big Dr. Facilier and Ursula as its big game plan to win. So if you have Dr. Facilier in play, then your creature combat or your character combat is how you deal with your opponent's threats on the board. And Dr. Facilier, obviously, when your characters are banished in a challenge, you get those cards right back. But even if you don't have Dr. Facilier in play, you also have cards like Hades that when the cards go to the graveyard, or cards go to your discard is actually what they're called in Lorcana, Hades can come down into play and get it right back. So this is kind of, I debated whether to put this in mid-range or control because it is kind of a mid-rangey kind of strategy, but this is, I think, more of a control deck that is trying to grind out wins and won't often win in anything other than the late game with Dr. Facilier or Ursula or Elsa or something like that in play. So I think that this is probably a little bit worse than the Ruby version, but specifically if you can find a particular piece of tech or a particular character that's good in the meta in these 2 colors, then it might be a better choice to bring to your local tournament. All right, now we get into the B tier of the tier list, and these are the kind of decks that are probably not going to win an event. But if you know that the meta is going to be favorable to them, then they have a good chance. So the first deck that we're going to talk about in the B tier is this Amethyst Emerald Tempo list. And this one hasn't had a whole lot of success in tournaments, but it has made the top 4 in a couple and the top 8 in a couple. And the reason for that is because it's very good at preying on particular kinds of decks. This deck is built around cards like Genie, Befuddle, and Mother Knows Best, which are bounce spells or bounce effects. And what that means is you can take opponents' stuff that they've put into play and put it back in their hand. Usually, that is not a great overall long-term strategy for the game because you're spending 1 card to put a card back in their hand. So in terms of like raw material, raw cardboard that you each have access to, you're throwing away a card and they're not losing any cards. So you're trying to end the game quickly, and you do that with cards like Genie that quest for 2. And it's very good when your opponent is playing big characters onto the battlefield. And you can take advantage of them playing 4, 5, or 6 ink spells, and then forcing them to redo that again the next turn, make no progress, and all the while you're making progress by questing each turn. So if you're not up against decks that have big characters, and then it's just a mild inconvenience. If you're just bouncing your opponent's 2 or 3 ink spells, then they can usually just replay them and still make progress their next turn. So this is not always good, but it is good in the right circumstances, and it has shown that it can make the top 8 in some tournaments. The next deck in the B tier is I've just kind of amalgamated all of the Steel mid-range decks into one, except the Amber Steel Songs list. So most of the Steel mid-range decks do exactly the same thing. They're using Smash, they're using Fire the Cannons, they're using Grab Your Sword, they're using Whole New World to basically deal with opponents' threats with direct damage and refuel your hand with cards like Whole New World. And once you've done that, it doesn't really matter how you win the game or how you end the game, as long as you have some big, powerful effect to do it. Steel by itself doesn't really have a lot of those big characters that can end the game on their own, or at least it doesn't have the best ones. So you can play Amethyst along with it and get access to something like Elsa. You can play Emerald along with it and get cards like Mad Hatter that close the game quickly. Or if you want a little extra ramp or removal, then you can play Sapphire for Let It Go and Grammatala and that kind of thing. So again, this is in the B tier because the color that you choose to go along with Steel is heavily meta dependent, and if you don't pick the right color for the right meta, then you'll probably just be worse off than if you'd picked the Amber Steel Song deck in the first place. But these other colors can be better than Amber given the right metagame. The last archetype, or the last deck in the B tier, is this Ruby Sapphire control list that you can see over here in the middle of the control column. And it is another control list, unsurprisingly, and this one is built around the same Ruby package that the Ruby Amethyst control is. So you have your Be Prepareds, you have your Maleficents, you have your Dragonfire, you have your Aladdin top end most of the time. And instead of playing Amethyst for the card draw, you are playing Sapphire for the ramp. And so the way that you get to the late game isn't by having a bunch of cards that let you interact in the early game. You're trying to just skip the early game altogether. And so you put a bunch of extra ink in your inkwell and hope to get to your 7 ink Be Prepared on something like turn 4 or turn 5, or your Dragon's Fire on turn 3 or turn 4. And getting to cast those spells or being able to play those cards a turn or two early can make all the difference. But it has all the problems that a normal ramp deck has. So if you don't draw the right combination of ramp and payoff, then you can find yourself unable to deal with your opponent's board, which is a bad place for control to be. And also, if you end up trading all your stuff for your opponent's stuff, you have no cards in hand each, you have a lot worse cards that you draw off the top. If you have a bunch of ink and no cards in hand, you want to be drawing cards that draw you more cards, like Friends on the Other Side, like Maleficent 3 ink, that kind of thing. But sometimes you're just going to draw a Mickey Mouse 3 ink, and it's just going to put a 1/3 in play for you and not make any progress. So the deck has some pretty big disadvantages, so you need a very good reason, I think, to be playing this instead of the Ruby Amethyst control. All right, and rounding up the tier list, we're getting into the C tier. These are the decks that if you bring them to a tournament, you probably will not win with a serious skill advantage. These aren't decks that prey on a particular meta. These are decks that just have a proactive game plan that is just... the format is overly hostile to it right now, no matter where you go. And the first deck in the C tier is this Amber Sapphire Stitch list. So this is kind of like the Ruby Sapphire list that we just talked about. It's still using the blue cards to ramp, and it has a powerful top end in this card, Hades, which comes into play Quest for 2 and is a removal spell or a removal effect on your opponent's things. But the problem is that is just not as good a late game as the Amethyst cards have access to. You try to mitigate that with Amber here. So the general strategy is that, okay, I have this 6 ink Stitch, and I have a bunch of early plays that ramp me. If you have Grammatala or some other early play to put cards into your inkwell, drawing them late game, like I said, is usually pretty bad, but if you have Stitch in play, then you can usually put them into play, exert them, and then draw the next card that you need and get some velocity through your deck that way. But the problem is if you don't assemble that, then your deck is kind of just doing mopey things. So this deck feels great when all the stars align and it does the things that it wants to do, but it's not the easiest thing to do. And even when you do, your opponents can sometimes just go way over the top of you because their plan is better. And the last deck, excuse me, that we're going to discuss today on the tier list is this Ruby Emerald Evasive list. This deck is designed to put evasive creatures in play and hope that the opponent can't deal with them. So you have Tinkerbell, you have Genie, and you have Pongo. All of those things are essentially immune to your opponent's characters acting to remove them. And early on in Lorcana, when we were just starting the format, this was a pretty powerful strategy because people were relying on their characters to control the board. But the problem is that the most played decks in the format right now are the two S tier decks, the Ruby Amethyst Control list and the Amber Steel Songs list, and both of those have very powerful ways to deal with characters that are not through combat. So the Ruby Amethyst list, of course, has Dragon's Fire, has Be Prepared, has Elsa, and all of those are good ways to deal with characters that are not normal combat. And the Amber Steel Songs list, of course, has Grab Your Sword, which is pretty potent, especially when combined with Tinkerbell. So if Tinkerbell comes in, they hit a bunch of your characters that have 3 willpower for 1, and then Grab Your Sword does 2 to finish off the rest. That is an absolute beating for the Ruby Emerald deck. And also there's just cards like Smash and Fire the Cannons that don't care about evasive either. So Ruby Emerald Evasive was a very powerful, aggressive deck early on. And maybe when the new set comes out and the format shifts around that, it will be again. But right now, this is probably not the deck to take to your tournament. So those are the decks that I picked out. This is the relative ordering, the relative rankings in the tier list that I think should hold up. We'll get more tournament results in the coming days when more of those tournaments are being played. But I'm very interested to see how this shakes out. Remember that card availability is the thing. So once cards are more available, you'll be able to like this might change because the relative representation of each deck in the meta will shift, and that will make certain things better and certain things worse. And also the quality of your opponents will just keep going up. And the more that happens, the less you can rely on them playing into your game plan, and that will make your life harder. So that is going to be it for this video. Again, once you've picked your deck, head on over to our sponsor, Coolstuffinc.com, and use our code ACADEMY for 5% off your order at checkout. You can build any of the decks that you see in front of you. And I would love to know which one you decide to build. Let me know in the comments what kind of players are you? Which deck do you have built, maybe? And when are you going to your store to play? I'm very interested to hear all about that. If you have questions, comments, you think I totally screwed up, you think this list is entirely backwards, I want to hear that too. Let me know down below. Like, subscribe, all that stuff, and I will see you guys in the next one.